time, we have two big challenges. The first is, we'll be able not to fall asleep after the lunch and the speech. I don't know, because lunch was very good and so, okay. But no problem, because the second challenge is worse. Because, thank you. Because the topic of this session is artificial intelligence and ethics in healthcare field. And artificial intelligence is a very difficult problem. But in healthcare means, first of all, data. And data are so boring. It's terrible. Numbers, Excel charts, no more. So it's not a good choice to put this session in the afternoon. I suggest next time, maybe in the morning, yes, or after the coffee, because, but I'm the chair of this session, and so I have to solve the problem. It's impossible, but I have only a little tip. And the tip is that behind every data, we have people. And we must remember this. Okay, we don't discuss about data. We discuss about people. And a good way in which we can manage them and help them and treat them. Okay, please remember people. I think is a good motivation to be asleep and to and resist to the temptation. Okay, but we also free people here inside on the stage, and we are ready to listen to them, to their experience, to their work. Ready to do? Yes. Okay.
Just one thing.
Only one thing?
It is
yes.
a typical Italian statement.
Yeah.
As at that time, normally is siesta.
In Rome, yes, of
okay.
course. But I come from Milan, please note. I'm a Swiss Italian man. I know. In Italy, it's too early. It's impossible to have a discussion at this time, of course. Okay. Jean-Daniel Rainhorn, physician, honorary professor in international health and humanitarian action in Geneva University. Levi Shapiro, interesting biography, is a prominent figure in Israel health technology sector, spanning investment, academy, and community leadership. We are very happy to listen to your experience. And Michel Danzinger, please introduce yourself.
I'm a scientist and engineer at IBM Research here in Israel in the division for AI for healthcare and life sciences.
Okay, he's the man of the data. Okay, we can start. We can start with Michael. The stage is yours.
Oh, okay.
Okay, you can use that microphone.
Okay, do we have the PowerPoint?
Yes, also PowerPoint. Okay.
We can try without it, but it'll be worse without it, I promise. Okay. So use this microphone? Yeah. Okay, so thank you for including me in this event. I am going to speak about the subject of AI, ethics, and healthcare kind of from the trenches. And maybe the data, I think of it as more about the activities than the behaviors than the data itself and the challenges and the thrill of it. And I'm going to try not to be too technical, but maybe a little bit more technical than some of the other speeches. So, I want to talk a little bit about AI ethics and why that's a problem in general. And then I want to shift to talk about a couple of specific questions that we've dealt with in our division that touch on trying to come up with solutions for the sorts of problems that arise when we try and deal with AI in a medical context. So, AI ethics, I think people don't really need to be convinced at this point that it's an important issue. We're always trying to balance how can we get the most benefit without leading to adverse outcomes. And so, there's supposed to be an animation, there's no animation, but AI is the first thing to understand about AI is that it's biased by default. All the AI systems that we see, They're fundamentally incapable of distinguishing what is from what should be. They see a pattern, they repeat the pattern. So here you can't really see, but I have here a whole chain of events from going back 5 or 6 years, repeating gender stereotypes. Man is to doctor, as woman is to, and then the AI will say nurse. It's not necessarily wrong, but it's repeating a bias in the society. This continues up until the snapshot of Twitter from just a few weeks ago, with the latest image models that are generating harmful content. And there's a lot of awareness of this in the AI community, and there are many band-aids that have been developed over the years, but a fundamental solution is still lacking. Another issue that's maybe a little bit more technical, this is a funny comic, this should hopefully keep people awake, is about the distribution shift. So in the comic, the people are just defeated the robot uprising, and I can't really see it in this cropping, but it says, it was so easy to beat them, why did they use spears and rocks instead of missiles and lasers? And he says, well, if you look at the historical data, the vast majority of battle winners used pre-modern weaponry, right? So, and the joke is that if the AI had only seen a list of things, it would say, okay, this is how you should behave, without thinking about what the implications are. So we call this distribution shift because you start out with some type of data, but then when you move from the training to the application, things change. So with medical AI, all of a sudden these questions, which are kind of annoying or kind of maybe unsettling, become very dangerous. The sort of biases of man as a doctor, as woman is to nurse, could become something like don't bother treating the poor because they're likely to have negative health outcomes. If you stay on the level of just predicting what's going to happen, you could end up turning a problem into a recommendation for future behavior, which is obviously extremely dangerous. And there's a famous case of a photo of a black man being labeled as a gorilla by Google Photos in 2015, where it seems that the issue was they just didn't have enough samples of black people in their training set. So this problem, which is an annoyance for the most part with something like a photo app, could turn into assigning someone a treatment where we don't really have evidence for them. We only have evidence for people who are maybe very different in their profile. So kind of in light of this, where's my button? Is my button work? Okay, so in light of this, I think we've sort of done a switch. There was a time that there was an expectation that we would have robot doctors, we have an automated medical system. We're not doing that. That's kind of we've really pivoted, I think, in the community to trying to exploit the strengths. AI is very good at finding patterns in data, not at deciding what's right. So to the extent that there's medical problems where our progress is being held back because the data is coming in at a rate faster than we can make sense of it, AI can be a very valuable tool for accelerating those discoveries. But we don't see it at all as being a substitute for doctors. It always is to assist the humans in prioritizing questions to then study with their methods. So now I'll go into one or two examples here where there's a potential for bias, a real potential for bias, and how we can try and overcome those problems. So there's a lot of personalized medicine is based on this idea of biomarker discoveries. If we could only find the right biomarkers, something that you could measure in the patient and tell you there's something about their prognosis or their treatment response, we could create a medicine that would be personalized, that would be better for people. And one example that's come up is what's called the polygenic risk score. Without going into the details, essentially you assign the person a number based on all of the genes that you're able to scan and say that people who have a higher number with this number are more likely to have a certain outcome. So this is a nice useful concept to the extent that it works. But here you immediately run into the problem of who did you train it on? What's the population that was used to train for this? Was it genetically diverse? What has been found is a little bit hard to see this picture, but the upper left panel, what you see here is a polygenic risk score, where risk in this case is height, We're trying to predict how tall a person is going to be based on their genes. And what they found was that if you took a training set of European genomes and developed a risk as it were, it's not really risk, prediction of height, and then applied the same model on an African population, you'll find that the Africans are predicted to all be shorter than all Europeans, was what came out. So obviously this is a problem, which once again is comparatively benign in this context, but you can easily see how it becomes, can be very dangerous if applied more broadly. So one way, and this is as technical as it's going to get here, I'm not going to really dwell on this so much, this is a recent publication from our group. There's a concept of invariant risk minimization. Once you become aware that there's a tendency for this to occur in the system, you can introduce an explicit penalty for your system that's developing if it only performs on a certain subset of people. That's what this equation means without going into it. You say, if I have people of 5, 6, 7 different ancestry groups, if my model only works for one of them, then change the model. I want to keep going back and changing the model until I find a model that's fair, that works for all of the different population groups. So for this type of a problem, this is one approach to a solution, which is currently a paper under review. Now I'd like to talk about something else, another place of enormous possibility, enormous potential, but also of a lot of risk, something else that we've worked on a lot. So there's the concept of clinical trial emulation. Of course, you have a randomized clinical trial. That's how all of the treatments are approved. But at the same time, you have access now, to varying degrees, to enormous quantities of records, patient records, that people received a certain treatment, what was their outcome. And of course, there are many, many ethical issues with collecting this data and storing and sharing and how it's used. But I think that's going to be the subject of another topic, assuming that we've set those issues aside. We say they've been handled in this case. There's enormous potential here. We can find out drugs after they've been in the market. Do they actually work? For a given patient, can we tell, should they get this drug or should they get that drug? If we've seen enough examples of people who've received one treatment or the other, also pharmacovigilance. If there's a drug that maybe it doesn't cause acute, severe side effects that are going to be reported, but maybe it increases the odds of some condition down the line. It's very hard to track that with the current pharmacovigilance, and observational data has a promise to help us answer those questions. At the same time, there's enormous risks of bias. Everything is biased in these systems. It's very hard to get a clean experiment. That's why we use the randomized control trials in the first place. So, for example, one of the cases that we looked at was specifically looking at, we want to see among patients who had Parkinson's. We're going to emulate a clinical trial in the observational data. We're going to find a group of people who received a given treatment and a group of people who didn't. We're going to look at the outcomes, the endpoints. We can derive all of this from the data post facto, and then correct for the potential confounders. Now, the naive application of this is the first thing. If you've never thought about the problem before, you might think maybe we can just take the people who received the treatment and then see if they had the outcome that we're interested in. If they did, then maybe it's a problem. If they didn't, then it's not a problem. But of course, outside of a randomized trial, this is completely unjustified, because the people who received the treatment received it because they had a tendency to have, they needed it. They needed that treatment, and so they're more likely to have those outcomes. The only way that you could make a fair assessment is if you could somehow de-bias the data, if you could compare this group with some representative group that's similar in a sense. And up to the extent that you have that level of detail in the data, you can do that. And the tool that we use to do that is what we call causal inference, which is a set of statistical methods which explicitly, under certain assumptions, will estimate not just the association between the data points, but to an estimation of the causal effect. So we effectively redo these clinical trials. This is kind of conceptually how one of the methods works, where you create a pseudo population. If you have only one person who had a certain property in the treated group, but many people in the other group, and you want to know whether the treatment works, you can effectively reweight the populations and pretend like you saw the same person 5 times, let's say, and that corrects for a certain type of bias. So in a case that we recently published, we found that zolpidem, the Ambien, a sleeping drug, actually showed some promising results as a potential treatment for Parkinson's. It has all kinds of other issues, so the clinicians we can discuss it at length. It's more of a proof of concept that you can extract meaningful information. I'd be happy to talk about the details. And because we're a technology company, at the end of the day, we're most interested in providing technological tools for our partners and for the community. So one set of technological tools that we've published on GitHub is this Causal Inference 360, CausalLib, and we're always looking for ways to really advance the state of the art across the board. And now I don't know if I have any time left, but one other issue that comes up, maybe I'll just touch on it very briefly, is explainability, which is of course important throughout the whole medical AI process, because we need to have humans in the loop at any given point, and these black box methods are not acceptable. Specifically in the emulated clinical trials, you can end up, because you're taking this population post facto, you can end up with a very unusual subset of the population that you've selected to run your experiment on post facto, at which point it's not even if you get a solid result, you don't even know who these people are, because you've sort of filtered them out in order to meet various criteria. You need to go back and now use some kind of explainability methods to understand who are we even talking about, and do we have any reason to believe that this is a actually worthwhile effect, a reasonable effect for the population at large. So for that, there's many, many algorithms. There's no answer to this question. There's many of them. Some of them have been compiled into another package that IBM Research has made available to the community on GitHub. So just in closing, I would just say that AI is biased by default. That is the reigning paradigm of machine learning will be biased for the foreseeable future. There's a lot of, I think the good news is that the research community is very aware of this. People know about these, the catastrophes that have come up, even just the embarrassments are very much in people's mind, and there's a lot of work on it. However, the challenges are quite fundamental. The models can't be debiased in a general way. There needs to be focused attention to each individual bias as it's discovered. And so there's a lot of promise here, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done. So I hope that it wasn't too boring, too much data or something, and I'm happy to discuss any questions.
Thank you very much, Michael. And any specific questions? Okay, the microphone, please. First line.
I want to thank the speaker, because he has addressed a very, very important question for the future. You know that predictive medicine is oversold presently. It's bullshit, because it's based on one single gene variant. Using PRS, this is completely different. This is a completely different matter as far as breast cancer is concerned, prostate cancer is concerned, because you start from the genotype of individuals who do have a breast cancer, or do have a prostate cancer. And based on this, what was unsolvable became understandable. And you know that there is now a category of 10% of people with a specific PRS pattern that are at risk of developing non-genetic breast cancer. So this is already valuable. While presently, predictive medicine was really oversold, bullshit, now it's becoming more and more meaningful. So I don't understand why you say that you are so biased. You are not that much biased. You are maybe biased by population issues.
That still counts as a type of bias. I mean, if you have a polygenic risk score that is systematically inaccurate for people of a certain ancestry group,
yes, but
then that's
yes. So this has to be repeated in different populations. That's
right,
it.
exactly.
It's not a bias.
Well, I mean, if you release it as is, I would call that a biased
I agree.
system, right? So
But
it needs to be.
what has been done for breast cancer, prostate cancer, has been done in Western Europe and North America, and it's valid for this population. What
Right.
you mean is it has to be repeated for other populations.
That's
the
one
poorest
solution, yeah.
population.
Or there needs to be an integrated approach that includes many populations at once.
Yes.
You could do it either way.
Anyway, thank you very
Thank you.
much.
Thank you for your comment.
Please.
Yes, thank you. Very interesting and very enlightening. It reminds me of the very early stages of statistics in clinical research, because we always were questioning ourselves what is the minimal amount of patients to have a statistical difference and to be sure that the results that you're presenting is accurate. So I would like to ask you, do you have or is there any minimal amount of population data to enter to your system before coming to the algorithm and the expert systems? Meaning, before publishing one expert system, do you have a minimal amount of data in order to avoid this bias that you're speaking about?
In general, yes. I mean, in order to test, for example, many treatments, each one needs to have statistical power, and they need to be corrected for multiple hypotheses, all of the professional steps. In terms of the diversity of the population upon which you're operating, I think that's a more subtle issue. I think you need to look at the research question at hand. So as the previous question noted, sometimes you can just stratify and you say, well, this study we're going to declare in advance. This happens a lot in Europe. There's not as much genetic diversity. So these results are for the European ancestry group, and we leave it as an open question how generalizable they are. But
Pharmacovigilance. The point that we have raised this morning.
Yes.
Inequity.
Inequity is the same.
Yeah.
Your first point.
Yes, absolutely.
Pharmacovigilance is very important, but it depends absolutely on the quality of documentation. And documentation is, for the most part, depends on the motivations of the doctors or nurses who's doing the job, pharmacists. And so phase 4 pharmacovigilance, which is very important, is subject to a bias of you would report more on an adverse event that you suspect them to be related to the drug because of some prejudice or some previous information. So, and I agree that pharmacovigilance is the only way to identify rare adverse events because they are all mostly identified between 2 and 4 years after the drug is out, because the phase 3 studies are not powered to look for them. They're powered to look for efficacy, mainly. How would you overcome the bias inherited in the reporting system?
yeah, I mean that's an excellent question. I mean, I think the wishful thinking approach is you would work with a national healthcare, a national, like for example the Kupot Cholim in Israel, where you would get the complete records for the patients, not only when they were specifically reported as having suffered a given adverse event. The ability to do that ethically and in what context and who, I think that problem has not yet been solved. There are organizational and legal issues with how would you set something like this up so that it could really answer the questions and deal with those problems that you've mentioned. And I really think that the ball is mostly in the legal organizational court, an incentives court really at this point. Who's really incentivized to conduct this level of pharmacovigilance? Definitely not the pharma companies. In theory, the national health. What's that?
With proper incentives, they could.
They could be, yeah. You could introduce incentives that would change that. But the current situation, it's the technology is there, I think, or almost there, but the interest is not yet.
Yes. The microphone, please, because.
You see, they don't speak.
I'm asking this as a researcher in psychology. Pharmacovigilance is one topic. Stress is a topic that is related to disease, and yet even researchers who study the evolution of diseases, the development of diseases, will do blood work, and they won't check for stress. And these are topics that are extremely important and oftentimes overlooked. They don't go into the data set.
Yeah.
And therefore, you're lacking something. I mean, not because you're not doing an excellent job, but because we're just not documenting, monitoring, examining, measuring.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, the whole vision of AI has a huge blind spot for the things that aren't recorded systematically. If it doesn't make it into the data set, it's just not going to make it into the model. Maybe you can find some proxies if you're lucky, institutionalization or psychiatric things, maybe. But in general, it's another very important point. There's things that you just don't see because they're not part of the system.
More questions? With a question, I introduce our second speakers because how much cost to accelerate human progress? Okay, probably many billions of dollars, but probably not only money. Maybe the medical secrecy. We have built.
It's not a progress; it's a regression.
It is great. We have built a cannibal system who cannibalize our lives.
Okay.
You're
This
Professor
is what
Rainhorn.
I have written some years ago, yes. Just take an example. Or you can put the slides, please. Okay. We are GPs. We are working in a clinic. You welcome every day 20 persons. You listen to them. You give them some advice. You prescribe some tests, some X-ray, and some treatment. You send a letter to a specialist. Then the situation becomes more and more serious. You send another letter to the hospital. The hospital and the specialist are speaking through emails. Finally, where is the medical secrecy? A lot of people can read the personal secret of those persons. The medical secrecy has disappeared. It doesn't exist anymore. Just they have some common beliefs that it still exists because my doctor will not tell my boss that I am a drug addict and I am HIV positive. But in fact, everybody can get my personal data. So it's a big change of civilization. For long, for thousand and thousand years, societies, religion, cultures, they have provided text to just to give some rules of the relation between the patient and the health worker, including the religion person. And now, we are less and less human being when you attend a medical consultation. You are more and more a stock of information that is managed by artificial intelligence and that anybody can sell, buy, use for their own interest without your consent. This is the world of today. It's not science fiction. It's our reality. It was 3 years ago in the same place, with some of you being there. This was my last slide concluding my presentation of the danger represented by the medical electronic records. And I ask, will this concept disappear quite soon? 3 years after, it's done. No more discussion. It's too late. So, examples. Last year, about 40 million people had their personal health information put on internet. It's a growth, permanent growth. More and more you can find your own data, even some of them you ignore, on internet. A strange vision of the medical secrecy. In the UK, the NHS accept the idea that 100,000 records, personal records, are put in internet every day. Recently in France, an attack of hackers put more than 500,000 medical records on internet. No more medical secrecy. Medical secrecy has a long story, but one thing has to be reminded is that for long, all the society, whatever are their religion, they share one thing: confidentiality between the health provider and the patients. The nice time of pencil and paper. You can draw on your paper, you can put your personal ideas that are not entering today in the form. Shall I write some confidential things on the form, but where? There is no space for that. You put your record in a cupboard, in your cabinet, or in the basement of the hospital. The possibility to leak is reduced to some person. All good times. Today, you have many, many ways for providing, for exchanging, for buying personal medical records. The first one is usual today. You steal. The hackers know perfectly how to enter in a hospital system. Every day, everywhere in the world, they enter and they ask for ransom or they publish. The second one is medical devices, which is a perversion. You help people in putting a pacemaker, have some MRI, you put a nice insulin pump, and finally, through those devices, you enter in systems because more and more often they are connected with some central in an hospital. Question: what will be, in terms of cost effectiveness, the idea of disconnecting all these medical devices? Will it be costly or not? We don't know. We haven't tried to to understand that. Another way, which is what we are doing every day, is the relation between our system and the, how can I say, the GAFAM, the big firms, that every day you fulfill with personal data, and finally you give for free a lot of very valuable information that they will sell. And in the billion and billion dollars profit from this company, you contribute to that. You just do your job, but you contribute. So what is more serious is when the national systems are selling the management or the data for research to those big companies. I just put you some example. UK NHS is selling every year data to Amazon, the French one to Microsoft, and a third of the best American hospital to Facebook. So is it the role of those public institutions to make business with those companies? One other thing which concerns some of us is the fact that we never receive any training about those questions. We ignore almost everything when we are fulfilling the system every day. So the fact that we medical doctors have sworn one day at the beginning of our career that we will keep quiet about all the data, all the information we'll get from the patient, we are every day doing exactly the contrary. So, is there mechanisms? Oh no, I forgot the most important one, which is you, us, every day, our smartphone. Smartphone is the most important way to fulfill the big data with our personal medical information. Should we suppress the smartphone? Impossible. So, should we accept the fact that medical secrecy has disappeared, and then how to design the future society where everybody will know exactly all your secrets, your personal secrets? I think it's an enormous issue that in such a place should be addressed. Are there reactions to resist to that? In fact, no, except marginally few things. The web is a jungle. Look at the way China government used the web to manage the COVID pandemic. It's purely a system of controlling the population. On the other hand, European Union create a sort of regulation, which is probably the most important step who has been done on that direction. But no one is really concerned by the fact that medical secrecy has disappeared. A last thing use the myth of anonymity, which is an important word for researcher. We suppress the name, the surname, the first name, and the date of birth, and we think that all the data are anonymous. Are we so stupid? When now the technology is able to recognize you. It's just an example that someone asked about that. It's you. There is an article in PubMed, I don't remember the author, showed that with 4 information on a cohort of 1.5 million people, you can 95% recognize each person. Much better than the finger. So, where is the medical secrecy? Disappeared. So, we are entering a society of transparency. I'm afraid. As André Malraux said, we are a miserable little pile of secrets, which is our identity. Identity. What will be our identity tomorrow? No identity. As Michel said, with the skin, as some others said about reproduction, everything, it's like a hidden desire not to be different from the others, but to be similar. A sort of process, unconscious process of standardization. It's not only the technology, it's also us. We are feeding the technology, knowing, for a group like here, a lot of things, but using the technology exactly as if there is no risk of harm. So we have to ask the question, is medical secrecy, the disparition of medical secrecy, an indicator of an evolution of the society to dystopia, like China? And are we ready to live in such society? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rainhorn. Any questions? The first line, please.
What do you think about the medical communication between doctors and nurses about one patient? How do you manage to do that? Because now we finish also the personal communication between a doctor and a patient. We become a communication between a patient, her family, his family, and a group of doctors and many nurses and other people who interfere with treatment. That means that the change is also that we move from a dual time between doctor and patient, multiple personality and the patient and the family, because the patient is not an object, now it's a person. So anyway, we have to share some data with other people in order to give the best following and treatment to this patient. So what you mentioned between the diminution of the secrecy of the everybody is perhaps not only that it disappear, because in fact it disappear, what I say, the communication between many people, but the utilization that we can do, the use of this data. Do you think that it will be possible to, with GAFA,
because you speak about GAFA, to limit, the knowledge and the selling of this kind of data? Or do you think that we cannot go back because we make a step in front with the collectivization necessarily of the medical data?
It's too late. It's clear that to use a computer or to use any ICT technology for exchanging data, for discussing, Zoom is a progress. It facilitates a lot of things, and we cannot go back for that. The question is, we live in a phantasm that the medical secrecy exists, and then I can tell you, the health professional, what I have in my heart or in my brain, and you are going to use it for other purposes than just to treat this person in sharing that with a group, as you said, or even with anybody. Because you don't know if in the group you haven't a person who can be interested in knowing a certain number of information that you are exchanging. So, for me, we are not ready to live in a transparency world. And we should probably prepare in such a meeting the future. For the moment, we are entering the future with the rules of the past. So it's a sort of mass destruction weapon of a population which is unprepared to work, to live with these tools.
What about banking? Sorry?
Financial information.
Yeah? It's a question?
Yeah, meaning banking is still,
Yeah.
To some extent more regulated. I mean, we're talking about ethics, so you don't want to regulate in a sense because then that's forcing people to be ethical. But on the other hand, with banking, people at least feel that their information is safe.
Okay, but how much you have on your account is probably less important for your personality than the fact that you have some disease or some behavior or some thoughts. But it has to do both with each other, but I think it's less important.
Probably it's suggesting that we have some instruments to regulate this process, and maybe Dr. Danzinger can help us in understanding.
Well, I think I appreciate your comments because it really raises important questions of what is the cost of the new world. I think, as you mentioned yourself, moving away from electronic health records at this point is not an option. No one, the efficiency, the cost savings, I don't think any health system would actually consider going back to a paper system at this point. I can say from our end, as a company who's trying to make use of these data, it's very hard to get a hold. Legally, it's hard to get a hold of patient records. By the time they're actually available to be used legally within a HIPAA-compliant environment, et cetera, it's been de-anonymized, and of course, there's every person with access to it has to go through training and must not use it for. Mostly, they're extremely nervous about identifying people, re-identifying individuals in the data set, which technically is possible much of the time. Legally is forbidden. So if people have a culture of compliance, if there are norms surrounding that, then one would hope that things would be okay. But I think it's an important point. Like, we don't really have a way to assess what the costs are, but at the same time, we can't go back. I mean, there's only forward, right? And how can we go forward better, I think, is the question that comes out from what you've mentioned.
Can I add something to that question? I had a study with Glenn Elwin from Dartmouth College where we saw that people are maybe 2,000 people a year in the United States, where there are more than 2,000 people living, complain about HIPAA violations. So I wonder to what degree people are actually willing to act upon breaches of privacy and security, or are even remotely aware of them and then willing to act, which is a totally different level.
Right. I mean, it's one of those legal regimes where it's not usually the people who are affected who are bringing the lawsuits. The lawyers are incentivized to locate HIPAA violations and to sue on the behalf of the people, with that, which releases its own set of perverse incentives. But
did you read somewhere that the responsible person of Cambridge Analytica were condemned after manipulating with psychological data given by Facebook for the American election 5 years ago? No one. They disappeared. I never heard about any tribunal who addressed this question. So legally, it's a pure fiction. In fact, Apple received a fine of $11 billion penalty in Ireland. It is the Irish government who asked the European Union that they don't pay this fine because they said, okay, if we have to pay that, we leave. So what is legally? It's a jungle. It's Far West.
Okay, we have a jungle, a Far West, because so this conversation helps us to understand that the topic of our discussion is a legal topic, is an ethical topic, is a cultural topic,
a philosophical
a
one,
philosophical
a religious one.
A religious one. The priests are everywhere. Terrible.
I have a question. I have a question to Jean Daniel.
Sorry,
here.
Where are you? Because we are okay.
Queen, what is the difference? It's the price you pay for communication. What's the difference between you driving a Tesla car and somebody get control of the car and knows everything and then can even decide to drive to a different place that you want, or the fact that me and you, we go to a restaurant with our telephone and people can trace immediately that we've been together. If it's a man and a woman, maybe it's worse, but it's the price you pay for communication. Better communication, more, it's not transparency, you just...
Okay, it's a society of transparency.
Exactly, it's a sort of transparency to the rest of the society. So I don't think there is a reverse wheel to go back from that situation.
No.
Once you proceed with communication, you pay. You
Okay,
agree?
that's clear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We can limit maybe the disaster. No? I mean, it's the high-end guy that I have to make sure. Because you just said, and I agree with you, and everybody, I think, agree that we cannot go, it's impossible to go back, and it's very alarming, and it's very frightening to think that George Orwell, you remember, 1984, and we thought that it would never happen, and it's something like that today. So maybe at least we can limit this disaster and feel more secure, because that's right. Everybody needs to communicate, and we use every day our smartphone and computer and everything, but it's frightening to think that, as he said, with the electric car or with the medical, because we speak about medical devices and medical secrecy, confidential, we don't have any confidential or privacy anymore. So do you think that we could use the artificial intelligence to limit or to use it on, on the, what do you say, to guide a better way and not to lose it? Because I don't know where we are going.
Unfortunately, time is running, so I suggest to listen to Dr. Shapiro, with his wide experience okay, with a big problem, so offer us a big solution.
Okay. Thank you. So, in the spirit of joining this discussion, I have a presentation as well. And essentially, I'm here to curry favor with Father Ciucci. As you can see, I put an Italian sports car into the cover photo. So hopefully we'll have softball questions. Also, I want to take a moment. I know we're short on time, but I think it's very important to recognize, appreciate, and acknowledge the amazing work of Bruno Cohen and the whole organization that enables not only this forum, but also the Prix Gallienne, the Dakar Forum. I do need to apologize. Unfortunately, Sharon Stone presented at Prix Gallienne, and this is what you've got. So we're going to work with what we can do. What I want to sort of address is kind of take it away a little bit from these very substantial, meaningful, spiritual and philosophical questions and actually distill it like a true American more towards the commercial, of course. And I want to talk about essentially what could be the century of biology, but just like this beautiful Italian sports car, Father Ciucci, you've had...
I usually drive.
Yes, that's what I thought. Yeah. I'm on my bicycle, but Father Ciucci has... in the Vatican, they've got a whole section.
Of course,
exactly.
around St. Peter.
But I think we're incentivizing the biotech community to build more Ferraris, but the infrastructure looks a little bit like these muddy roads. And I want to talk about where we are and where we need to get to. And so perhaps we'll advance the slides. If they don't advance, I'll just continue and introduce myself. I am on the faculty at the Hebrew University nearby, teaching in the Biomed MBA. I'm also running a health tech nonprofit for all of the Israeli technology startups addressing healthcare. And then finally, I have an investment fund, the Pragmata Venture Fund, focusing on biotech and device, and also what we call the Internet of Biological Things. And over beers tonight at dinner, I'll be happy to tell you what that means, and I'll go into more detail. So it's a very exciting moment. Oops, wrong direction. I believe this is, without a doubt, the century of biology. I think we saw that with the rapid development of these amazing vaccines in a once-in-a-century pandemic. But I also think that we need to learn from where we've been in order to understand where we're going. So if the 20th century was about the century of physics and folks like Einstein pushing us towards aviation and personal computers, I think we are headed in that direction with biology, but we want to avoid the nuclear war and social destruction that we had last century. So there's a lot to work on. I'll keep doing that throughout my presentation. I'll go backwards to make sure you're listening. What have we seen? Just in the 10 years that I've been involved on the investment side, phenomenal increases in breakthrough technologies that are going to push the limits of human, plant, animal, and ecological longevity, sustainability, and health. And I've just listed about 4 or 5 that I'm going to run through very quickly. There's CAR-T. Some of you may have heard about CAR-T. There's now 6 indications, FDA approved, including leukemia and lymphoma, in which CAR-T genetic treatments are already on the market. How about a pill to cure, not a pill, I'm sorry, but a treatment to cure child blindness? All of this from genetic editing, right? Just phenomenal stuff. Another example, cystic fibrosis, a pill that improves breathing, which is most people with cystic or CF, cystic fibrosis, don't live past the age of 35, partially because breathing is extremely difficult. This is a pill that a genetic-based pill that can enable 14% more breath per second. So just amazing breakthrough stuff that I've just observed. That was only 5 years ago. There's CRISPR. Who's heard about CRISPR? which won the Nobel Prize. And the best part about CRISPR is that within a decade, we've gone from lab to actual treatments. It's live. We are editing people. We are editing individuals, living people. This is an example, SMA, unconquerable diseases we're now able to treat. And essentially, the larger point is we're getting to a place where the breakthrough technologies are now inhibited not by the technologies, but by the infrastructure that can support the assessment, adoption, and commercialization of those technologies. So what am I talking about? Jean-Daniel, do you know what I'm talking about? Just making sure. It's after lunch, so we're all a little sleepy.
No, I'm not an Italian.
So you don't sleep after lunch?
No, never.
Oh. Yeah, Israelis sleep during meetings after lunch, but we don't do the formal, right?
Well, I sleep the rest of the meeting.
Yes, okay. So along came COVID, and COVID represents the best and the worst of our infrastructure for bringing technological breakthroughs to the patient. On the one hand, somebody talked about the incentives. All of the incentives were in place, including for governments. All of the incentives were in place to take technology from a lab and put it into a patient's arm. And it was beautiful, and we had people who were very keen to participate in 30,000 plus person randomized clinical trials. And yet, we also had clinical trials related to ivermectin that were misinterpreted. Everybody and their sister was rushing a clinical trial out the door, claiming that it represented something larger than perhaps it did, and there was a lot of confusion. And confusion is the enemy to change. So this is a visual of a triple negative breast cancer. Essentially, we now, as a result of some of the things that were applied towards finding a vaccine for COVID, we can actually, at the individual cell level, edit, change, and address very serious diseases. So, as in honor of being in Israel, it wouldn't be a presentation without recognizing that we live in a place with a lot of drama. But the point of the visual, which is about testing planes, is that when you test a plane, you know it flies or it doesn't fly. In biology, unfortunately, 90% of medicines fail the process, representing enormous wasted resources and inhibiting real breakthrough. So what is stopping this? What is the problem? And can we do better? And shouldn't we do better? In some ways, we're doing very well as an industry. In some ways, the last 10 years, I would say, 2012 to 2021, 430 new medicines came to market. We're seeing an increase in the number of medicines. But they're not really addressing some of the biggest problems, right? Congestive heart failure, heart attack. Putting together that kind of clinical study can require hundreds of thousands of participants in a randomized clinical trial, which is really unwieldy. And so the incentives, back to that key word that came earlier, the incentives are in place without the right infrastructure, which is the visual I put here. The incentives are in place for rare disease. And so rare disease with smaller randomized clinical trials can be brought to market and commercialized at an extremely high margin. And so instead of addressing heart attacks, which is the leading cause of death in the developed world, we've seen a very, very amazing growth in rare disease treatments and resources dedicated towards those outcomes, which is great for that population. but it is inhibiting the breakthrough technology that can really drive longevity and all sorts of outcomes. What do we need? Your classic randomized clinical trials. But what we really need, again, magic word, I believe, is incentives. We need an infrastructure in which the vertical stack of players, including providers, hospitals, including insurers, but most particularly national governments and health services. We need them to get into the clinical trial game where they're not playing and they don't want to play. Even hospitals are incentivized, not necessarily for breakthrough technologies, but how do we increase our margins when they participate in clinical trials? So what we need to realize the century of biology isn't technology. We've got it. What we need is to align incentives and coordinate our infrastructure to be more productive, do more randomized clinical trials at scale, or smarter, using technology, which we can talk about in a minute. I do want to use one example. Here in Israel, we were able during COVID-19 to use this pool of data for predictive processes. I know that that's not going to sit well, the word predictive, but understanding drug-drug interaction. What's going to work to treat the population? An even more successful program was called Recovery. Two academics, I believe from Oxford in the UK, used EHR data from the NHS to identify what treatments are most likely to have a positive impact on people that are COVID positive. Very effective, very low cost. We need more of that. What we're getting instead is a lot of real world evidence. So walking around with your Fitbit, it's a lot cheaper to measure that and track that, and it's not irrelevant, but it's still not the same. And so pharmas are pushing more and more real world evidence in lieu of the high cost of a randomized clinical trial with hundreds of thousands of participants. So what do we need? We need the equivalent of roads and bridges. We need infrastructure to realize this century of biology. And this really has to happen if we want to achieve what's possible. Right now, all the market incentives, and I'm guilty of this as an investor, all of the market incentives are about reducing risk, minimizing cost, doing the least amount possible in order to get a drug to market in the highest possible margin. So all of us as a society have some thinking to do. And what I'm going to share, it's not all pessimistic. Essentially, there are players that recognize that technology does play a role in bringing efficiencies and scale to randomized clinical trials and broadening the reach. Companies like Medable, companies like Verily, which is a unit of Google, just got $1 billion in funding. Companies like Science 37 recognize that only 3% of patients participate in clinical trials. Something like somewhere between 6 and 8% of physicians, physician researchers participate. So companies are undertaking that, recognizing that if we leverage a lot of the sort of technologies that were mentioned by Michael and IBM, there's more to be done. There's a lot more to be done, and sort of achieving those scalable types of randomized clinical trials and broadening the pool of potential medicines that come to market. And I think in the interest of time, I'm going to finish on, let's leave this here for a while. We are, all of us, I would say, that I see on the innovation side, trying to build more Ferraris. No more Ferraris. Let's build the roads. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we have the time for one question. Okay, first line.
Thank you very much, Levi, for an interesting presentation. We are sitting in an ethical forum. And I think that the major challenge of this meeting is to prevent from for false promises for the sake of the patients. And I'm interested, we are the group who found the gene for spinal muscular atrophy in 1995 with Judith Melke. So we are very happy that the first advances as far as treatment are concerned are now present. But when you talk about DNA editing, you know that it's not for tomorrow, not even for the day after tomorrow, because of off-target effects of CRISPR. And I think that it is our duty in this forum to sort apart the facts and the promises. I would like to hear you about this, please.
Sure. So my policy is for the easy questions, I'm happy to take them. For the hard questions, I like to give that to Father Ciucci. He's closer to St. Peter. There's another joke that, you know the difference between a good question and a great question? A good question is when you know the answer. A great question is when you have a slide. And I have neither. So I'd like to see the century of biology be a reality. And right now, that's not the way that the folks like me are oriented. That's not the way, certainly, the United States government is oriented. I think NIH should need infrastructure here. And they need to get into the game, just like NHS did with the recovery project during COVID. And we're never going to see a lot of those technologies if the ability to assess them isn't improved. So we don't know what gene editing can do, but we'll never know if we're not motivated. We have a follow-up question.
Okay, unfortunately, we can cancel our privacy, but we cannot cancel coffee break. But I'm an Italian man. No coffee break. No, in the program we have a coffee break now. No, because yes, there's a coffee, but because I'm an Italian and the coffee is the best place where it's possible to continue our conversation. So we continue to work in the other room.